Okay, I'm going to go straight on into more of Tom Cheetham. The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin and the Angel Out Ahead. This time, chapter 6, Ta'wil and Prophetic Philosophy. And I would recommend the summary, which is episode 16 in this series, because I don't really have time to summarize anymore. So it's called, the section one is called The Key to the Soul and the Key to the World. Let's see what Cheetham has to say. Prophetic philosophy is based upon the occurrence of revelation, the descent of the divine presence into creation. Prophet is not someone who foretells the future. A prophet is a messenger, a carrier of the divine word. In the Abrahamic tradition, as conceived in Islamic thought, there are many degrees of prophecy ranked by their nearness to God, and there have been a multitude of prophets. Only a few of these had the task of establishing new religions: Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. In Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as well as Mazdaism, though the religion of Zoroaster is not mentioned explicitly in the Quran, the revelation is tied in various ways to a book. The central fact for the prophetic philosophers of Islam is the existence of the sacred book. The revelation of a text makes the idea of understanding its true meaning and the hermeneutic situation that this implies the central issue for human life. But in the context of divine revelation, text takes on a meaning not generally available to modern philosophies of language. The hermeneutic key to understand prophetic philosophy came to Corbin through Heidegger, but the prelude to this lies in Luther, and through him, in the scholastic tradition of speculative grammar, in which the notion of significatio passiva, I think it's like passive signification, was crucial. Okay, let's try to find out what Luther means by this term. Yeah, so obviously it refers to passive righteousness, which is where, sorry, God's justice is given to a person through faith rather than something earned through human works. Obviously to central to Luther's sort of understanding of salvation, seen as a gift of grace from God, not as a result of human effort. Okay, so and this is in the context of basically we have the idea that through Corbin and Islamic Sufism that revelation is sort of important. There's a sort of you could say value to revelation, although that's the wrong kind of language, but um, we have to approach it somehow. And so then it's like, okay, like what kind of revelation? And then there are different kinds, and then one of them is sort of the trying to understand the revelations which have been given in the form of these texts, which is maybe different than direct revelation. And so we're trying to understand what is Corbin's sort of hermeneutics to understanding prophetic philosophy through Heidegger and from Luther through the notion of yeah, sort of revelation or salvation by grace. Corbin says, in the presence of the psalm verse in Justitia tua libera me, in the presence of that psalm verse, Luther experienced a moment of revolt and despair. What can there be in common between this attribute of justice and my deliverance? He perceived in a sudden flash, and his entire personal theology was to result from this experience, that this attribute must be understood in its significatio passiva. That is to say, thy justice whereby we are made into just men. thy holiness whereby we are hallowed, etc. Similarly, for Ibn Arabi, the divine attributes are qualifications that we impute to the divine essence as we experience it in ourselves. Okay, so this is sort of, the Protestant point, in a way, of direct experience. Cheetham continues, Corbin says that this insight provided the key for understanding the meaning of mystical philosophy in Islam. It provides the connection between the divine attributes and those attributes as they appear in the created world. Upon the significatio passiva hinges an entire cosmology, an entire metaphysics of creation. It provides another way of understanding the connection between metaphysics, the intellect, and the transformation of the soul. Now we get a quote from Corbin going, one simple example. The advent of being in this theophany is the placing of being in the imperative kn esto in the second person. Is the placing of being in the imperative kn esto, meaning in the second person. This is primary. It's neither ens nor esse, but esto. B. This imperative inauguration of being is the divine imperative in the active sense. But considered in the being that it makes be, the being that we are, it is the same imperative, but in its significatio passive. I'm going to repeat that. Okay, so he's talking about the advent of being in this theophany, which is the sort of being as an imperative, be. And this is a kind of, he says, inauguration of being, which is a sort of divine imperative in the active sense that, let's say, God can sort of decide, in a way, to be. And so when we experience that, as he said, but considered in the being that it makes be, the being that we are, it is the same imperative, but in its significatio passive. As he said earlier, that is to say, thy justice whereby we are made into just men, thy holiness whereby we are hallowed. One could say, I think, that this is the triumph of the hermeneutic of Verstehen. To know that what we understand in truth is never that to which we experience and submit to. To know that what we understand in truth is never that which we experience and submit to, that which we suffer in ourselves alone. Hermeneutics does not consist in deliberating on concepts. It is essentially the unveiling of that which takes place in us, the unveiling of that which we make issue from ourselves. A conception, a vision, a projection. When our passion becomes action, an active suffering, prophetic poietic. Okay, that was Corbin, who's sort of talking about prophetic philosophy or revelation in Heideggerian terms. let's continue with Cheetham, who says, hermeneutics is an unveiling. It's not an operation on a text in anything like the modern sense of criticism, whether historical or literary. It's not a linguistic exercise at all in the usual sense, or a conceptual manipulation based upon reasoning. It is an uncovering, a process by which we participate in the blossoming, not of ideas or words, but of images. It occurs in the imaginal space between the soul and the text. So what I would connect here is that like when I'm reading this, it is a transformative experience. My sense of things is changing as a result of reading this. And that's kind of the point, like this that hermeneutics or interpretation, right? I guess as I've been demonstrating, is not exactly about criticism, although I've certainly been critical. But it's also about an uncovering, an unveiling process, which according to Cheetham occurs in the imaginal space between soul and text. Okay, Cheetham continues. From the perspective of the metaphysics of presence, ideas and words as we have come to understand them occupy a space equivalent to that which is occupied by objects. Ideas and words as we've come to understand them occupy a space equivalent to that occupied by objects. They are the dead shells of the images, the visions that take place in us, and in which the task of hermeneutics, the words and ideas, they are the dead shells of the images, the visions that take place in us, and which it is the task of hermeneutics to unveil. Yeah, so I mean here, so we have the idea that our ideas and our words are a kind of fallen form of these visions or images, which through this kind of prophetic philosophy we can restore our sense of or unveil. I think again I would have the input that that's probably not going to be primarily effective through philosophy as we understand it, even a revised form of philosophy like Heideggerian phenomenology, for example. We need that ecology of practices for reasons, which is probably why Plato and Pythagoras were doing that sort of thing in the first place, not to mention many other kinds of people. As we were saying, from the perspective of the metaphysics of presence, ideas and words, as we've come to understand them, occupy a space equivalent to that which is occupied by objects. They are the dead shells of the images, the visions that take place in us, and which it is the task of hermeneutics to unveil. By conjoining hermeneutics and the imperative to be, Corbin forces the insight upon us that understanding as unveiling is our most passionate mode of being. Here, I would say that there's this quality of being. Well, it's not a quality, but the point is that it's sort of through effort, through passion in some way, through this unveiling process, that in a way one is being. And there's a way of conceiving that that's sort of not everyone is being to the same degree. The imperative to be is the source of the intensification of existence upon which is the basis of Mulasadra's metaphysics of individuation. The command is not from the ego, but from the Lord. And this being is neither thinking nor acting, but a prophetic, poetic passion that combines both. It is imagining. Here is the question between the merely human and the divine. Sorry, here's the connection between the merely human and the divine. Okay, so what we have here is the idea of an imperative to be, and that there's a particular way of doing that, which is here has a Heideggerian flavor. It's a kind of via positiva in a sense. That it's connecting this metaphysics of individuation through that sort of the process or practice of unveiling, or we could talk about unfoldment. And so, yeah, this is sort of is a combination of sort of Heidegger and Jung in a way, but it's particularly focused on the role of prophecy and of revelation. The idea that sort of passion is a way towards this passion in the way of hermeneutic unveiling is a way towards that. And that leads again to this notion that there sort of you can exist in a way more or less. We can be more or less. We may disagree. We may agree that that is the case, but then disagree about how to do that. But anyway, we have this is conceived of as a sort of command from the Lord to be. And this, as an imperative, is sort of neither, it's not about thinking and it's not about acting. It sort of combines both, and hence it's sort of conceived as imagining. So this is a way that sort of phenomenology can be taken as imaginal work. Which I would say is sort of recovering the depths of our language in a way. It's sort of using language as it's sort of converting the fallenness of our language into prophecy, into revelation. As he said, this being is neither thinking nor acting, but a prophetic, poetic passion that combines both. It is imagining. Here is the connection between the merely human and the divine. Without this active movement in us, we remain trapped in subjectivity. Without this active movement in us, we remain trapped in subjectivity. I think there's a way that I see one of the mistakes here being, look, you can have a lot of active movement and go into all of this philosophy, but I think there's a way that it all ends up being sort of more subjective, if you know what I mean, rather than less. And so it's sort of, I get what they mean in the sense that like through this sort of prophetic movement of practicing in this way, the one can sort of in a way go more toward the transjective and sort of get out of the subject-object split, and therefore it's kind of less subjective. Um, but that would still make it it's still very, in a way, private, personal, or individual. And I'm not saying that that's unimportant. But again, what about with others? We now get a quote from Corbin, who is probably characteristically difficult to try and, well, let's see what Corbin has to say about it. He says, but this implies that this person is an agent only in a superficial and metaphoric sense. More active than the person himself is the thought that is thought through him, the word that is spoken by him and personified in him. And this thought of his thought is precisely what Nasir Tusi calls the angel of his thought, or of this word or action. This angel endows the soul with the aptitude for thinking it and rising by it. This angel endows the soul with the aptitude for thinking it and rising by it. He is the archetype, the finality, without which a cause would never be a cause. He is the destiny of that soul. The act of thinking is simultaneously a being thought by the angel. The act of thinking is simultaneously a being thought by the angel. These propositions describe a hermeneutic circle which fuses the schema of angelology with the process of angelomorphosis. Okay, here I would say that simply the idea is that, again, sort of language is a virus from outer space. The idea that through this kind of prophetic philosophy or sort of Heideggerian phenomenology, understood as in a as to sort of toward revelation, toward grace or salvation, in that way, that can go along with that is not only it's a process of imagining, but it's also here understood as a self-transformation. It's a, again, angelomorphosis. I'm reminded of Greek theatre. So that's quite straightforward to me. So let's keep going with Cheetham, who says, this hermeneutic circle has a far larger circumference than that of agnostic philosophy. It includes the more than human. It is up to us, through our passion, to unveil it. Okay, so that's profoundly valuable because we get here a version of philosophy that is Gnostic and transpersonal, or at least making the transpersonal available to us. Of the utmost importance is Corbin's elision of prophetic and poetic, meaning elision meaning the process of joining together or merging things, especially abstract ideas. Definitely. So it's a very elusive process. Anyway, so the utmost importance is Corbin's elision or merging, joining, combining of prophetic and poetic. And I'm reminded of Barfield, poetic participation. It is this connection with the divine realized through spiritual birth or angelomorphosis as a never-ending process, which is impossible without the ontological reality of the imagination. The spark of divine creativity in us, par excellence. Okay, so here we had the ideas that connect sort of prophecy and poetics as a practice, with sort of, I'm reminded of John's Lectio Divina. This is also connected with one's connection with the divine, with spiritual birth, with this angelomorphosis, with a kind of eternal return or never-ending process, and that all that is impossible without the reality of the imagination, which is, quote, the spark of divine creativity in us. Cheetham continues, this divine spark, personified as the Paraclete, or Holy Ghost, is for Corbin the primary point of contact and communication among peoples of the book. He is searching in all his work for the living source of prophetic religion in the Abrahamic tradition. It is found in part in the primordial and eternal reality of the individual, which defines the quest common to the three major monotheisms. In the end, this commonality rests upon the relation between these two modes of being, the prophetic and the poetic. Okay, so he's been trying to get at sort of what's common to all three. Earlier, he was talking about spiritual chivalry, whatever that means. We don't quite know yet. Now he's sort of talking about the primordial and eternal reality of the individual. And then that there's a commonality resting on the relation between prophetic and poetic. So it might have to do with sort of the creation of the individual in this way, um, where the sort of Holy Ghost, which is the divine spark of the imagination, which is personified as the Paraclete, has a kind of key role in this. Quote, a tradition lives and transmits only if it is a perpetual rebirth. A tradition lives and transmits only if it is a perpetual rebirth. In this creative movement of the spirit lies the key to esoteric metaphysics. It is the pivot point around that all of creation is ordered. It is the pivot point around which all of creation is ordered. So definitely this is in the right sort of territory for me. I like this stuff. This is on the right track. The idea that revelation is something that can be sort of in a way sought after or participated in. In a way, it's something to be done, but it's not quite. Yeah, no, it's easy to talk about it in the wrong way. Cheetham continues. It is in this way that we must understand the transformational nature of hermeneutics and Corbin's use of the term phenomenology. Quote, hermeneutics is the proper form of the task of phenomenology. Cheetham says that this spiritual hermeneutics is the centerpiece of any philosophy worth pursuing. As Sayyid Hossein Nassar comments, Corbin's identification of phenomenology as a hermeneutics that has as its aim the disclosure of the hidden levels of being is at variance with the usual meaning of the term phenomenology in Western philosophy. In the first place, it requires a belief in the reality of those other levels of being. Okay, I don't think that has to hold us back if we're sort of open-minded, and you're gonna be careful though. I mean, yeah, so basically Corbin's like, hey, this is what phenomenology is supposed to be, guys, not this, normal Western philosophy thing. And I think that is a lot more interesting to me, along the lines of Jung and Hillman, involving the imaginal, involving personification, involving sort of archetypal work, soul work. It's in a way a lot more relevant or human. I think Viveki is really helpful here because if we can get out of the trap that requires sort of belief first. I don't know that it does require belief first and foremost. I think belief may come afterwards. I think it first and foremost requires belief in the possibility of transformation, the possibility of revelation, the possibility of participation. In a way, I think that's all the belief that we need. That it might not ultimately be sufficient, but it's kind of like, oh, the idea that, oh, we don't believe in that. I don't think that is a sort of good enough stopping point. Like, I don't know, I think Viveki really helps with that sort of thing. Anyway, it continues. For the peoples of the book, the primary fact is the existence of a revealed text, the Word of God. In Islam, the Quran occupies the place that Christ does in Christianity. For Christianity, Christ is the revelation, the Word. In Islam, it is the book itself. Corbin says, by its nature, at the heart of a prophetic religion, that is, a religion that professes the necessity of superhuman mediators between the divinity who inspires them and humanity as a whole. there is the phenomenon of the sacred book that every prophet who has the quality of a messenger brings to man. This phenomenon preeminently creates a hermeneutic situation. The great issue being to know and understand the true meaning of the book. Okay, so here we have a couple of ideas. First of all, is that this this style of prophetic religion is deeply connected to the necessity for there being these superhuman mediators. And it's sort of that it's those mediators that sort of transmit through human prophets in a way. Then we had further ideas that it's that every prophet brings a book, and I don't know that that's the case. I mean, I'm sure I think that there are many prophets who didn't bring an entire book with them or through them. I'm not sure that it's fair to identify prophecy with um, the phenomenon of a sacred book, but it might be. And anyway, that because that's how we get this sort of hermeneutic situation of trying to understand the true meaning of the book. And there's a way that, well, of course, I would find that to be valuable, but I sort of also noticed that there might be something about prophecy or revelation that has an independent value as a process, sort of independently from the hermeneutic attempt to appreciate the meaning of the revelations that have already been given. It's yeah, I'm making a process and product argument. It's like yeah, the importance of prophecy and prophetic religion seems to me just as much about the process that produces such sacred books, as it is about the books themselves that have come down to us. And I might sort of yeah, there are going to be questions about relevance. Um, yeah, I mean you're going to be really yeah, it's like annoy a lot of people, but it's kind of like well, there's a way that we've been trying to interpret some of these texts for a long time, and we sort of the situation sort of as it is, and it's kind of like do we just need to like interpret it differently or and I'm like I don't know I feel inclined more toward hey what about the process of practicing uh prophecy and revelation and like that although yeah involving different sacred texts I think is I think that's a wise thing to do. Let's continue with Cheetham, who says, but on this view of hermeneutics, it is impossible to interpret the text without at the same time transforming the reader. Reading becomes a liturgical act of transformation. Yeah, so then we get into sort of what kind of transformation and why? Well, maybe yeah, maybe how is a better question. It's kind of like there are lots of kinds of transformation. You can eat breakfast and that's transformative. It's like, and you can also there might be like if we can understand a bit more of the way in which we're trying to transform ourselves or the kind of transformation that we think is it's so tricky though because you can't know beforehand if it's a transformative experience. So it ends up being you sort of transform yourself in whatever direction you feel is right. Who am I to criticize that? In any case, I would say that we're sort of talking about prophetic philosophy, prophetic religion as a transformative process, and here that's being conceived of as sort of yeah the hermeneutics of rereading these sacred texts as liturgical acts of transformation. And I may be pointing out that there is a process that comes first, not to deny the transformative power of reading as liturgy. But let's continue with Corbin, who says, the mode of understanding is conditioned by the mode of being of him who understands. Correspondingly, the believer's whole inner ethos derives from his mode of understanding. The lived situation is essentially hermeneutical. A situation, that is to say, in which the true meaning dawns on the believer and confers reality on his existence. So it seems to me that Corbin here is talking about a feedback loop between our mode of being and our mode of understanding. So our mode of being influences what we can understand, and when we understand more, that influences our mode of being. And in this way, this kind of reading as liturgy is transformative. And so it's supposed to sort of, yeah, feed back into our lived situation. As he said, the believer's whole inner ethos derives from his mode of understanding. The lived situation is essentially hermeneutical. A situation, that is to say, in which the true meaning dawns on the believer and confers reality on his existence. Yeah, so the idea that one can, in a sense, personhood and existence can be deepened and confirmed and granted through that process. Cheetham continues, hermeneutics, far from being a critique of texts, results in the conferral of reality on the believer, and ultimately, through the encounter with the angel, promotion to the rank of person. It is only by virtue of this dual hermeneutic of the inner meaning of the text and simultaneously of the soul that the book lives in the present. Okay, so there's a relationship, again, a feedback where hermeneutics is a kind of reciprocal dynamic between the inner meaning of texts and the inner meaning of the soul. And this is the way in which such a book may live. Without this, the literal letter of Revelation is only, quote, a dead body, an absurd husk. Without this inner sense, the Quran would have been dead for a long time. The Quranic revelation would have long been only a museum of theological curiosities, which in fact is what it truly is in the eyes of the agnostics. Cheetham continues, the kind of reading that is at issue here is far from unknown in the Christian tradition, but it faded from view along with the cosmology and the anthropology that support it. Okay, so in the Christian tradition, we know about this stuff, but it wasn't sort of brought front and center. Okay, well, why not? And so Cheetham is going to refer to Ivan Illich to show this, or to suggest why. And Cheetham says, Ivan Illich has shown that during the 12th century in the Latin West, a transition occurred from one kind of reading, one kind of hermeneutical situation, to another. And in confirmation of Corbin's thesis, this is correlated with an alteration in the very experience of the self, of what it means to be an individual. So the idea being that as we lost this kind of hermeneutics, we actually forgot ourselves. And that went along with a change in our reading. Quote, in his study of the Didascalicon, Didascalicon of Hugh of St. Victor, sorry, Illich, or Illich, I think it's Illich, details a change in the phenomenology of reading that is most striking in the present context. He takes Hugh, oh, this is Hugh of St. Victor, as representative of the monastic approach to the Holy Book. Okay, he writes, quote, reading as Hugh perceives and interprets it is an ontologically remedial technique. It is a remedy because it brings light back into a world from which sin banned it. Reading is an ontologically remedial technique because it is a remedy because it brings light back into a world from which sin banned it. Okay, let's keep going. In the world of monastic readers, huddling over their parchment texts and reading aloud to themselves, the study of a text was an embodied activity, a challenge to the student's heart and senses even more than to his stamina and brains. Study meant something more akin to sympathy than to the abstract intellectual pursuit that it has become. Yeah, it's kind of like this quality of resonance with the text. And the enlightenment that is the end result of this study is not the light of reason as the rationalists understand it. Quote, the light of which Hugh speaks here brings man to a glow. Wisdom could shine through the pages of the book, bringing the letters and symbols to light, and kindle the eye of the reader. Wisdom is not only in the heart, but in the object itself. Wisdom is not only in the heart, but in the object itself, in the world perceived with sympathy. I'm reminded of the depiction of the spiritual master whose name I forget in Hermann Hesse, the glass bead game. Now, there's a wonderful depiction of a master who really lives this kind of glowing that is very real. It's a real quality. Wisdom is something that can be, I mean, this is kind of like sainthood in a way. So wisdom as embodied, the embodiment of wisdom in this quality of glowing. Again, the light of which Hugh speaks here brings a man to a glow, brings man to a glow. Cheetham says, Illich, as an historian of technologies, argues that an essential part of this phenomenology lies in the physical act of reading itself. An essential part of this phenomenology lies in the physical act of reading itself, that is closely tied to the literal presentation of the words on the page and on the necessity of oral reading in the Carolingian minuscule. Reading is a carnal, rhythmic, synesthetic activity. Yeah, I mean, check out, I mean, I published a couple of videos on Henry Munn and his essay, The Mushrooms of Language, which is the best expression of this kind of thing that one could want, as far as I have found, although I haven't read the Quran. Okay, so reading as a carnal, rhythmic, synesthetic activity. David Abram, building on these insights, themselves built upon those of students of oral traditions, notably W.J. Ong and M. Parry, points out that in Semitic languages, the lack of written vowels requires a kind of participation on the part of the reader that is not necessary in the fully alphabetic script developed by the Greeks. Wow, that's a big deal. Let's get that again. Ready? David Abram, drawing from these others, points out that in Semitic languages, the lack of written vowels requires a kind of participation on the part of the reader that is not necessary in the fully alphabetic script developed by the Greeks. To experience the consonantal language of Hebrew or Arabic, it must have the life literally breathed into it. This is still true today of the Quran. It is recited aloud. The letters must be activated by the breath. Not only this, but which vowels are chosen to be breathed is left to the reader. Neither the words nor their meanings simply lie there inert upon the page. Barry Holt's writes of the sacred texts of Judaism, quote, "We tend usually to think of reading as a passive occupation, but for the Jewish textual tradition, it was anything but that. Reading was a passionate and active grappling with God's living word. It held the challenge of uncovering secret meanings, unheard of explanations, matters of great weight and significance. Torah called for a living and dynamic response and remains unendingly alive. For the tradition, the Torah demands interpretation. All of this applies equally to the Islamic tradition." Okay, so I'll just finish off with what Cheetham says about this, and then I'll come back to the rest of the section. Cheetham says, Abram's central claim, and Illich's, the claim of Illich as well, is that for such a phenomenology of reading to exist, the text must not be abstract and disembodied. It must remain connected to the body, the breath, and the world. According to Corbin, such a phenomenology and the hermeneutic it requires maintains in existence a relation of the soul to the text of the book and to the cosmos. Again, according to Corbin, such a phenomenology and the hermeneutic it requires maintains in existence a relation of the soul to the text of the book and to the cosmos, which we have lost. What arose with the alphabetic technology invented by the Greeks and inherited by us was an abstract use of language, and a sense of the text as fixed, final, and finally public that we take for granted today. All texts are esoteric for us, including the text of nature. Sorry, all texts are exoteric for us, including the text of nature. And at the same time, by a kind of symmetry, the fixation of the public text is accompanied by the implosion of the self into a private interiority that is understood as subjective. And so, thanks to our history of being, we confound the esoteric with the subjective. We confound the esoteric with the subjective, and therefore the unreal, and the exoteric with the objective, and therefore the real. Paradoxically, by severing the inner and the outer, by banishing all sense of interiority from the world, and losing connection to the word, language is increasingly experienced as occurring in the head, a wholly human creation. If only humans speak, then there is no word, no text. Okay, so we've been talking about the sort of phenomenology of revelation, in a way, the phenomenology of reading. So And yeah, I mean, I don't think it has to be just about reading text, although it definitely can be, you know. Um, there's a way I think of through dialogos, transformative dialogue, reading what's happening as as if it were a sacred text. But I think definitely, you know, scripture can help us to get into that. And here we had sort of again the sort of through Luther the sort of direct connection, the idea that sort of Heideggerian hermeneutics through this phenomenology, this kind of phenomenology, this metaphysics of presence can help us through the sort of imperative to be. And so there's this deep connection between our metaphysics here, the intellect, and the transformation of the soul. It, I mean, this centrality of angelomorphosis, so transformative experience that involves sort of again sort of contacting and developing relationship with intermediary beings. Again, it's toward developing personhood. It had to do with a key role given to passion, be as an imperative, but it's not a thinking or an acting. It's a kind of prophetic, poetic passion that combines both. So it's an imaginal style, with the emphasis on, yeah, Heideggerian unveiling, letting things be as they are. Phenomenology, phenomenon and logoi. Yep, and so prophetic and poetic are going together here. We also talked about the Paraclete, you know the Holy Ghost is sort of conceived as this the ontological reality of the imagination that is the sort of spark of divine creativity within us. And then we're sort of elaborating on the hermeneutics that this implies. So, you know, drawing from sacred texts in order to evoke their meaning in a way. So reading becomes a liturgical act of transformation. I pointed out there's a sort of preceding process by which revelation comes into being, um, that may or may not be supported by reading as a liturgical act of transformation. We also had the idea that, yes, through this sort of encounter with the angel, this kind of um, hermeneutics and prophetic philosophy, that we're promoted to the rank of person. So the idea that personhood is tied into this in a certain way. And then in the West, we've sort of we've lost this when we sort of changed our style of reading, where reading can be sort of ontologically remedial if we recover it. It has to do with sort of sympathy with the world, where reading is as much about the heart and the senses as with the stamina and brains. And again, even with the book, it's going to be taking us. I mean, we see the profound role here of the body and of the breath and of sort of intonation and rhythm, and a lot more than, in a way, abstract intellectual pursuits. We have this is tied to the development of reason, an evolution of our understand. Sorry, it's tied to the development of wisdom, and it involves an evolution of our understanding of reason. We talked about how that's different. This is all different in the Quran because it's literally not doesn't have vowels, so it has to have this life breathed into it, and that the alphabetic language may have lost something with that. How interpretation was so important in Judaism and to the Islamic tradition. Yep, and then so we've sort of inherited this idea that we understand that texts are exoteric. We don't have any appreciation for the esoteric meaning that is accessible because we don't have access to these practices which co-transform both the meaning of text to us and our own souls. in this dynamic feedback loop, kind of a reciprocal opening way that Vervaeke has also talked about in depth. Yep, and so we sort of the esoteric has become sort of limited to the subjective, and I think a whole point of the bringing this sort of more esoteric readings of things into group practice is that it can be shareable. Where yeah, our interiority has been sort of banished from the world. If we can, um, yeah, be a bit more oriented to sharing, and yeah, a bit more in the world, a bit more we can connect actually to the word in this way. The idea being that when we allow that which is sort of archetypal or in Corbin and angelological to speak through us, then sort of without that, then there actually isn't any word. That this kind of prophetic philosophy is actually the source of logos in a way. And I'm going to come back to the rest of the section, which is more about uh, Illich, Ivan Illich, and David Abram, and also with quite a few more quotes from Nasser, from Corbin, on the Islamic versions of this, focusing more on Ta'wil. Okay.